Well, good morning again. My name is Reverend Dr. Matt Stone. I sure am glad to be here with you this morning as we are already in the fourth week of Lent, which is really genuinely hard to believe. I think that's right. Is it the fourth week of Lent? Right? Wait, today's the third week of Lent. Oh boy, I've lost track. That's how quickly Lent is going by. Lent is the season of preparation, and it feels like it is slipping away. Very clearly, it feels like that season of preparation is slipping away. I don't know what your life is like right now. My life feels like it is accelerating. There's a lot of stuff that tends to crowd out time to get ready for Easter. That's why Lent is so important. It's important to talk about. It's important to do the season of Lent as followers of Jesus because it gives us a chance to slow down as life accelerates to make sure that we're ready on Easter Sunday morning. So this is the third week of Lent. Nope, it's the third week of Lent. I just realized it. It's the third week of Lent. And here's how I know that. Because in the first week of Lent, Pastor Sean did a great job introducing Jesus' first word on the cross. Part of the way that we've been trying to get ready for Easter is by looking at the last words of Jesus on the cross. And so we heard that the first word on the cross was a word of forgiveness. And then last week, we heard that the second word on the cross is a word of invitation to come home to the King's garden. Both of those, by the way, are reported to us by Luke in Luke's gospel. Today, we're going to move over to John's gospel. So if you have your Bible, if you want to follow along, we're going to be in John chapter 19. We're going to start in verse 25 here in a few minutes. But last words, like we talked a little bit about this last week. Last words are an interesting thing. Sometimes they're very meaningful and they're just they just cut right to the heart. And sometimes they are, let's say, more surprising. I was given, my mother-in-law gave me a book called Famous Last Words by Ray Robinson, who also wrote the first adult book that I read as a kid. It was a biography of Lou Gehrig called Iron Horse. Ray Robinson collected a group of last words spoken by people. And it's a very quick read. It's really interesting if you want to take a look. But here's a couple examples of surprising last words. Fred Harvey was a famous restaurateur and railroad revivalist. He brought back the luxury railroad. It's an interesting story. You should go read it or find out more about it. It's not exactly church appropriate, so you go do that on your own time. But here's his last words. Right? Remember, this guy's in the restaurant business. This is how he makes his fortune. He gathers his sons on his deathbed. I can kind of imagine the scene. He says, "Come closer, sons." He says, "Remember, don't cut the ham too thin." That's it. He's done. That was the last word. Remember, don't cut the ham too thin. I'm not sure if his sons expected that. Maybe that's exactly who he is. I don't know. But that was a little unexpected. Oscar Wilde, you may remember a famous author, Oscar Wilde. This is a little bit contested as to whether or not these were actually his last words, but reportedly he says at one point on his deathbed, he says, "I'm in a duel to the death with this wallpaper. One of us must go." All right, buddy, you bet. One of us must go. Wilson Meisner is an interesting guy. His description is dramatist and con man. I like that as a description. I wouldn't want to be called that, but that makes me interested in what his last words were going to be. And Wilson Meisner was on his deathbed. He was unconscious for quite a long time. A priest comes to give him last rites. He wakes up on his deathbed while the priest is here, and he says, "Why would I talk to you? I was just talking to your boss." And died. Oh my goodness. Sometimes last words are unexpected. Sometimes they're funny. Sometimes they are surprising. The next word that we're going to hear from Jesus on the cross is not at all funny, but it is surprising. It is unexpected. It is not exactly what I think Jesus is about to say. And because of that, when we hear this next word from the cross, we tend to skip over it. We skip over it either because it's so unexpected as to make us not be curious, or we skip over it because we're not really sure what he's getting at, and the next thing he has to say is a little bit easier for us to understand. But when we pause, again, it's so crucial during this season of Lent, when we pause long enough to understand what Jesus is saying on the cross, what we hear is something, I believe, that is profound for how we live. So John's gospel it tells the story of Jesus' death a little bit differently than some of the other gospels, so we'll just set the scene a little bit. John, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke, report that Jesus is carried out to Golgotha. He is crucified with one criminal on his left, one criminal on his right, and then we hear that Pilate orders a sign to be put on the top of the cross that says King of the Jews. There's a kerfuffle about whether or not that should be above the head of Jesus as he is on the cross, but Pilate says, I wrote what I wrote, deal with it, or something kind of like that anyways. After that, the Roman centurions begin to divide up Jesus' clothing, and they cast lots for it. That's where we're going to pick up the story. This is in Luke 19. I'm going to start in the middle of verse 25. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. It's interesting. We have Mary, and Mary. And this people have spent a lot of time trying to figure out one of these in particular. Mary, the wife of Clopas, is not exactly sure who it is. What John makes clear to say is the women were there. And I don't want to skip over that too fast either. That's not really what the sermon's about. But the men weren't there. The men who had traveled with Jesus for years in ministry were not there. But the women were there. They were there to bear witness to what was happening to Jesus. And keep this in mind. Sometimes when we see artistic depictions of the crucifixion, we see that Jesus has been crucified on like a sequoia tree, like a redwood that is 400 feet tall, towering into the air. This is not at all realistic. It makes a theological point, but it's not at all realistic. Remember that when Mary show up to the crucifixion of Jesus, they're looking at Jesus face to face. Because the trees weren't that tall, but the centurions didn't want to work that hard either. They're not crucifying people way up high. They're crucifying them at ground level for two reasons. One, it's easier. Two, it maximizes the humiliation of that moment because there is no distance between the crucified and the witness. This is an incredibly painful moment into which John is inviting us. We hear that Mary, his mother, Mary, his aunt, and Mary Magdalene are all there. And when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved, we're going to call that guy John today. It's never been proved that the disciple who Jesus loved was named John, but I don't want to keep saying the disciple who Jesus loved, the disciple who Jesus loved, the disciple who Jesus loved. So for our purposes today, will you allow me to just say John instead? When Jesus saw that his mother, I asked that question and didn't wait for a response, by the way. That's a pro move. I'm just going to do it. When Jesus saw that his mother and the disciple whom he loved, John, was standing beside her, he said to his mother, "Woman, here is your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Here is your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. Now, a couple of things, and I just want to dispense with the first one pretty quickly. Jesus starts by saying, "Woman," and every time I read it, I think, geez, Jesus, maybe soften the edge a little bit. Because for us, when you have a one-word sentence that is followed by an exclamation point that is woman, what I tend to hear is a middle-aged drunk man in the 70s who's sexist. That's the word that I hear. Let me assure you, that's not Jesus. Let me assure you, that's not what Jesus intends. This word is a word of deep respect. Right? Jesus isn't disrespecting his mother at all by saying woman. It's a tender form of address. Woman, here is your son. And he says to John, here is your mother. Now, it doesn't make the most sense, right? What is Jesus doing? That's why it's unexpected for me. What is Jesus doing right here? Because Mary isn't John's mother, and John isn't Mary's son. So what could Jesus be thinking about? That's why we move past it so quick, because it takes a little bit more work to figure out, is there any meaning here? Or perhaps is Jesus, in the dying moments of his life, having suffered so much already, maybe he's just saying things and he's not really aware of it. I think there is more going on here than there may appear. He does a curious thing with one of his last remaining breaths before his death. He does a curious thing by making those who are not family into family. Now, listen, we've talked about this a couple of times at this church, but it has been a while. And so if you weren't here, or perhaps if you've forgotten, I can't imagine how you would forget anything that was shared on a Sunday morning. But if by chance you've forgotten this critical fact about first century Israelite culture, it plays an important role in what we're going to talk about this morning. In first century Israelite culture, the family is the organizing principle of your life. Your blood-related family is the organizing principle of everything about your life. Your family determines where you will live, what you will eat. Your family determines who you will marry. Your family determines how you will be provided for and how you will be protected. The Betab, the Israelite family in the first century, is the organizing principle of everyday life. This is how God established Hebrew families to exist. It's how he planned for their care and concern. The challenge is Jesus has been messing with that almost from the beginning. And it's really interesting to look just at what Jesus has to say about the family. I'll give you a couple of examples from Matthew's gospel and Mark's gospel. In Mark chapter 3, Jesus is gathered with some disciples, and his mother and brothers come looking for him. And so some folks in the crowd say, "Hey, Jesus, your mom and brothers are looking for you." And Jesus' response is not, "Oh, let me go find them." Jesus' response is, "Who are my mother and brothers? The one who does the will of my Father, that's who is my mother, my brother, my sister." He starts meddling with the concept of family. He starts messing with it. He starts to reorient the notion of family, which is hard enough for us to hear. It was unimaginable, I think, for a first century Jewish family to hear what Jesus is doing. Over in Matthew chapter 4, he begins calling some of the disciples to follow him, and he sees Zebedee and his sons in a boat fishing. Now, let me assure you that if you're in the first century and you're fishing, it's not because you enjoy a day out on the Chattahoochee catching trout and putting them back in the water. It's not because you went to Piedmont Park and caught a bass. We didn't know, by the way, this has nothing to do with the sermon, we didn't know there were fish in Piedmont Park. We'd never been there until a couple of weeks ago. And my son caught a bass in Piedmont Park Lake. I wouldn't eat it to save my life, but there are fish there. Anyways, back to the sermon. If you're in the first century, if you are Zebedee and his sons and you're fishing, it's not because you enjoy a day out on the water. You're fishing because that's your family's livelihood. That's how you provide for your family. There are only commercial fishermen. There are only people fishing for the provision of their family. Jesus sees these three in a boat and says to James and John, the sons of Zebedee, he says, "Follow me." And I love imagining Zebedee in this moment, because James and John get out of the boat, leave their father behind and the family business behind, and they start following Jesus. And Zebedee's just left in the boat like kids these days. That's not a new phenomenon, by the way, in case you thought that was a new thing. It's not a new thing. Kids these days, they leave him behind. Jesus is meddling in the family from the beginning of his ministry. A couple of chapters later, in Matthew chapter 8, somebody comes to Jesus and says, "Hey, I'm going to follow you. I'm excited to follow you. I'm ready to follow you. My dad just died, so I need to go bury him, but then I'm going to follow you." And Jesus, what we expect him to say is some word of compassion and grace and generosity. Take the time that you need. And instead, what he says is, "Let the dead bury their own dead." Jesus is reorienting the notion and role of family in the first century and the 21st century. Here's the last example. It's one of the hardest passages, I think, to understand in all of the New Testament. This is Matthew chapter 10. Listen to what Jesus says. "Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever does not take up the cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Those who find their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake will find it." From the beginning, We could almost characterize this as an assault on the first century family. But Jesus has no aim or desire to take down the family. What Jesus is doing is reorienting the family with himself at the center. He says, your blood relationships are not the defining relationships of your life. He says, your relationship with me is the beginning, the middle, and the end. Everything that the family had represented is now accomplished by this new kind of family. The organizing principle of the gospel family, as it turns out, is one's relationship with Jesus. Right? When Mary and John show up at the foot of the cross, when they meet at the foot of the cross, they each have relationships with Jesus. Mary is the mother of Jesus, has known him since he was born. John is the beloved disciple of Jesus, has walked with him the entire way. They have relationships with Jesus. And what Jesus does with one of his dying breaths is to look at Mary and say, because of our relationship, you are now his mother. And he looks at John and says, because of our relationship, you are now her son. In the way that the first century Israelite family provided for, protected, cared for, loved each other, what Jesus now says on the cross is, my followers will care for each other like that. He redefines the family in light of himself. Anybody who has a relationship with Jesus now also has a broader circle of family. By the way, this is exactly what's happening in baptism. We are baptized into God's own family. There's a reason that Christians have used that at times quite hokey language of Brother John or Sister Sally. It's because we have become family by virtue of Jesus' own words from the cross. Now, all that is lovely. Right? What a nice notion. What a quaint idea. But you start to put that in practice, and things start to get rough in a hurry. Imagine Mary and John, what their remaining life might have been like. Certainly there would have been moments of shared grief, shared joy, but there were also, because they were human, moments of shared frustration. You know what family's like. There were moments of misunderstanding. There were moments where Mary said, yeah, well, I was his mom. And John said, yeah, well, I was his best friend. Right? There are moments of friction and tension. And Jesus did not say, y'all are family except when it's hard. Y'all are family except when you disagree, and then you're not family. It's okay. He didn't say that. He said, this is your mother, and this is your son. By virtue of your relationship with me, all of your earthly relationships have been transformed. Now, here's what haunts me about this. What haunts me about this is the following. I will run through a wall for my family. If some client of Margaret's tries to come at her, I'm ready to fight. I know I'm supposed to be a pastor. I know I'm not supposed to say that. But I'm ready to jump in the middle of it because you don't come after my wife. You don't come after my family. I'm ready to run through a wall. If a friend of one of my kids starts picking on him and saying mean things about him, I'm ready to harm children for the sake of my family. I'm not saying I've ever done it. Never done it. I'm just telling you emotionally, I will do anything for the sake of my family. Here's the problem. Jesus says, my family is more than the 3 humans, 1 dog, and 1 cat with whom I live. Jesus says, my family is all of you. So if that's how I think about the folks I live with, that must also be the way I think about my brothers and sisters in Christ, that I'm ready to run through a wall for you. You are ready to run through a wall for me. Not the violence part. You got to leave that part out of it. I see now that I shouldn't have used that particular example. But you feel what I'm saying. The way we think about family, because of Jesus on the cross, must radically change. This whole conversation, you heard Sean talking about it earlier, this whole conversation about praying for our neighbors, about serving our neighbors, about gathering for our neighbors, this is not a church growth strategy. This is an attempt to hear what Jesus says on the cross and live it. How can we not? One of the dying breaths of the Savior of the world calls you into a familial relationship with your brothers and sisters. How can we not listen to that and respond? That's what this is about. Jesus' last word here, maybe surprising, maybe unexpected, but I'm not sure there is anything that meets us on a more daily basis than how we view our brothers and sisters in this room and how we view our brothers and sisters who don't yet know that they are our brothers and sisters.